Afternoon, folks. Professor Davis here again. I hope you're all doing well. I'm assuming at this point, if you are watching this clip, that you have already completed my Part 1 lecture on ATP and respiration, and we're now moving on to Part 2 of that discussion. Last time, we talked about what the ATP molecule is. We looked at its chemical structure, how it carries energy, why we need ATP as an intermediary between glucose and our other chemical reactions. We discussed the reasons why glucose is such a useful molecule for metabolism. And we went step by step through the process of aerobic respiration, detailing all the things that need to happen in order to extract the energy from the glucose to make the maximum possible ATP. So I'm assuming that is your background going into all of this. If you haven't watched that yet, I recommend you go back and do so that you have that foundation going forward. If you're in my class, I also recommend you might want to have the handout that I produced for this and post it to the Blackboard site in front of you for whenever you go through this, so that you have that as a reference for the terminology and occasionally for some math, some equations involved. All right, then. Now, one thing I said last time when we were talking about all this is that aerobic respiration is the far and away most efficient way of doing this process. Aerobic respiration is going to yield a lot of ATP, yielding approximately at optimal conditions 36 ATP per molecule of glucose. In actual real-world conditions, anywhere between 29 and 36. Still an awful lot of energy for every food molecule we're putting in. In terms of actual calories you get out of that, to convert that into nutritional terms, you're going to get approximately 4 kilocalories of energy out of every gram of glucose that your body metabolizes. Or to put it better, every gram of carbohydrates, since as I said last time, glucose is not the only carb we can use for this purpose. So carbs on average yield 4 kilocalories of energy per gram. In aerobic respiration terms, that works out to 36 ATP molecules approximately for every 1 molecule of glucose. Not bad. It's way better than any anaerobic organism is doing. But carbs are not the only molecule that we can get energy from. Your diet does not only consist of carbs. You're taking in fats, you're taking in proteins. These are part of our diet as well. So, how do we get energy from those things? Now, let me preface this by saying, especially in these days of keto diets and so forth, that all living cells are optimized to use glucose as their primary source of fuel. Well, not all, but there are always exceptions to every rule in biology, but nearly all living cells, including the cells of our bodies, use glucose as their default energy source. Metabolic pathways are built around it. You can't get glycolysis started by shoving a fatty acid or an amino acid into it. It just won't work the same way. Chemically speaking, you all know why. Enzymes can carry out one particular reaction. They bond to a specific substrate. The enzymes that bind to glucose will not also bind to fat. So we cannot simply swap in other molecules for glucose and expect things to work out the exact same way. All other things being equal, your body prefers glucose. In fact, most good nutritionists will tell you that you should probably be deriving about 64% of your daily energy as a human being from carbohydrate sources. Carbs are our friends. The problem with carbs is not that carbs are bad, carbs are not the enemy. The problem is if you eat way too damn many carbs. But that's a basic rule for pretty much anything, that anything is toxic or dangerous in large enough quantities. That includes carbohydrates. So eliminating carbs from your diet and trying to replace them with other molecules is not really doing your body any favors. If your body is not getting sufficient carbs, what your body starts to say is, uh-oh, I'm in starvation mode. I'm not getting enough of what I need on a day-to-day basis. There must not be enough fuel available. Therefore, what your body begins doing is prioritizing the creation of storage molecules and shutting down unessential processes. So, you reduce your carb intake by too much. A lot of people go on keto diets and say, wow, I feel great, I got so much more energy now and everything. But long term, it's putting more metabolic strain on your system, because all the other molecules we metabolize for food are slower and more difficult to break down. And glucose is really what the reaction needs. You can't get around that need. So be careful with your carb intake, just like with anything else. But if you're getting 2/3 of your daily calories from carbs, you're probably not doing yourself any disservice. Now, of course, if you are an herbivore, if you're a cow, if you're a goat, if you're a sheep, if you're an organism that subsists primarily on plant matter, obviously carbs are the core of your diet. You're getting way more of your energy from carbs because you're not taking in a lot of protein and fats. You do take in some. You can't eat any organic thing without having some combination of proteins, carbs, and lipids as part of its composition. Now, if you're a carnivore, if you're a wolf, if you're a fox, if you're an animal that by default feeds on other animals, flip that around. Proteins and fats become the core of your diet. Carbs become a relatively rare thing for you, and your metabolism has to take that into account. We as human beings, like almost every primate, are omnivores. That is, we are optimized to utilize both plant and animal foods in our diets. And when I say optimized to use both, I don't mean freely switch between the two. I mean your body needs nutrients and amino acids that are harder to get from one or the other, and therefore we evolved around the quote-unquote assumption, if you will. We evolved around a dietary strategy that included both plant and animal food products. I hate to say it, but anybody who tells you that vegetarianism is a more natural way of making a living is quite simply ignoring our evolution. If you want to know very clear anatomical evidence for that, right here. Canine teeth. Nothing has canine teeth that doesn't consume meat. Horses don't have them, deer don't have them, sheep don't have them. If you're an herbivore, you're going to have lots of big blunt molars and premolars. You're going to have nice sharp incisors for clipping through your grasses and other plants, but you're not going to have canines. Canines are piercing and tearing teeth. They're there to deal with animal protein. So if an organism has canines, that organism is evolved to consume meat at least as part of its diet. Now, any given omnivore is going to like a little bit more or a little bit less of certain food sources. That's okay. Certain omnivores subsist on more of one thing or the other. Bears, contrary to what you might think, actually eat way more plants than they do animals. And being an omnivore means that if you have one of those things scarce, you can kind of make up the difference with the other one. But you do have to worry about some nutritional deficiencies if you're not getting one or the other nutrient over a long enough period of time. So, how do we get energy from things other than glucose? Let's talk about this a little bit. So you need a big old meal. It's got glucose, that is carbs. It's got protein. It's got lipids in it. You got, your Thanksgiving dinner with your turkey full of protein, fat, and your mashed potatoes, stuffing, which are mostly carbs, and your corn, which is mostly carbs, and your gravy, which is really, let's be honest, mostly fat, and all these things are mixed together in one meal. Your body is going to metabolize all of them at once to a certain extent. Now, glucose is the priority for metabolism, meaning that if it's available, we tend to use it in preference to anything else because it's the easiest thing to do. But I don't want you to think that our bodies are saying, okay, we're going to use up all the glucose is gone, now let's go to something else. In reality, you're going to metabolize that whole Thanksgiving dinner at once, but in terms of the proportions of energy you're going to get from any given one of those things, carbs are the preferred source. And we're going to use them whenever we have them more than other things. Now, if carbohydrates are inadequate, then we are going to switch to using fats as our second priority energy molecule. Fat is our reserve. You as an animal keep fat as a storage molecule. It is something that your body holds on to specifically as a caloric reserve for times whenever you are not getting enough of other molecules in. So if you're dietarily deprived, keep in mind that in the wild, humans are hunter-gatherers. We started off as hunter-gatherers before we had civilizations and grocery stores and so forth. And as a result, your ancestors couldn't guarantee where their next meal was coming from. Fat storage evolved as a technique for ensuring that an animal would have something to draw upon if its other energy sources were not coming in sufficiently. So when glucose is not doing as much as we need it to do, we switch to fat. Fat becomes our secondary metabolic molecule. Now, the process of metabolizing fats is called beta oxidation, using the Greek letter beta, or Greek equivalent of the letter B. And it's going to work a little differently than what we're doing here, but it's going to fit into the process we already know. You might recall last time when I talked to you about pyruvate oxidation, I told you that at the end of pyruvate oxidation, if you have any energy left, that is, you have acetyl molecules left that are not needed to make ATP at that given moment in time, spare acetyl is going to be stored in the form of fatty acids. We're going to convert excess acetyl from our diets into fats and hold it as an energy reserve. In our body, fat stores are kept in cells called adipocytes, A-D-I-P-O-C-Y-T-E, adipocyte. Fatty tissue is deposited in several parts of the body, right around the abdomen, in the breasts, in the hips, in the thighs, and underneath the skin all over the body. The female body, on average, stores about 8 to 14% more fat than the male body. This is an adaptation towards having extra energy reserves to feed a developing infant. You're going to find all female mammals store more fat than their male equivalents. So beta oxidation is the process of breaking down fat for energy. When you put fats through beta oxidation, what you're doing is you're breaking acetyl groups one by one off of their fatty acid chains. Those acetyl groups that we're breaking loose can be thrown directly into the citric acid cycle, bypassing the first two steps of aerobic respiration. So we basically are liberating stored acetyl that was packed away from excess from previous consumption that didn't need to be used for ATP at a given point in time. So beta oxidation gives us acetyl groups that we can inject into the process of aerobic respiration that's already running, and we can put more acetyl into the citric acid cycle and thereby increase the amount of energy we're getting out of it, increase the amount of ATP that comes out of it, increase the yield of NADH and other electron carriers. How efficient is this? Actually, gram for gram, fats are way more efficient than carbs. Fats, on average, give us 9 kilocalories of energy per gram. More than twice as much energy as carbs, which you might recall, give us 4 kilocalories of energy per gram. So you might ask yourself, why is fat not our default metabolic molecule? A couple of reasons. One, fat is a comparatively rare molecule in nature. Plants don't produce anywhere near as much of it as animals do, and even in animal bodies, the majority of the tissue is going to be muscular tissue, not fatty tissue. So fat is not the most abundant source that's available. We would not really be able to sustain ourselves long-term on fat as the primary energy molecule. Secondly, because fats take longer to break down. Beta oxidation takes longer than aerobic respiration and the metabolism of glucose. So it's not as easy a process metabolically speaking. And remember, it's all about speed. It's making ATP as fast as we can. But thirdly, and perhaps most importantly for the chemistry that you have to worry about, is that when you break down fats for energy, you don't just get acetyl. You're also going to get a byproduct at the end called ketones. K-E-T-O-N-E-S. Ketones are a carbon-based molecule that is the waste product produced whenever you metabolize fats. It's what's left behind after you peel away all the acetyl from the fatty acids. The problem with ketones is they can accumulate in the bloodstream. As they build up in the bloodstream, they are acidic in solution. They cause the pH of your blood to drop. As the pH of your blood goes down, you will eventually begin to succumb to a condition called ketoacidosis. Ketoacidosis is not a comfortable time. It's going to be characterized by fatigue, by eventually labored breathing. After a while, you'll kind of a sickly, sweet, appley smell on your breath. Kind of sounds like, kind of smells like rotting apples. You're going to have muscular tremors. You're going to have neurological problems. Eventually, you'll give way to convulsions, go into a coma, and you can die from this if the pH of your blood gets too low. Remember, blood acidosis is a non-trivial problem. We mentioned that very early on in the course. Ketoacidosis is exactly what happens to an untreated diabetic. Basically, if the cells can't get enough glucose, what do? They metabolize fats. And therefore, diabetics shed weight very rapidly. Untreated diabetics will shed weight very, very quickly. And that means that those ketone bodies are building up and building up and building up in their system. Your liver can process them given enough time. But if you're taking in too much fat too quickly, it starts to become an issue. This is the big problem with keto diets. that whenever you're on a so-called keto diet, you're not getting enough carbs, you think to yourself, oh yeah, this is great. My body will just burn off fat. Everything will be terrific. Except you have A, the problem of ketoacidosis, especially the longer you do it, the more likely this becomes. And two, you're putting more metabolic strain on your body overall. It has to work harder for that energy, and that is not necessarily a good thing. It puts more strain on the cells. Furthermore, whenever you're taking in that keto diet, keep in mind that you're also taking in a lot of other things that come along with the fats and the proteins, higher cholesterol being exhibit A. So you're going to find a lot of people on keto diets. Yeah, sure, you may shed some weight, but you're also going to find that you end up with higher cholesterol levels, higher saturated fat levels, greater likelihood of arterial blockages, and all the dangers of stroke, heart disease, and so forth that come along with that. So all in all, I would not recommend a keto diet. There are two situations in which it's not a bad idea. One, diabetics have to watch their glucose intake. For a diabetic to be in a low-grade state of ketosis, where you've got more breakdown of fatty acids going on, is not a terrible thing as long as you manage it carefully. And two, if you are epileptic, for reasons that are not clear, we do not know what's going on with this, it seems that keto diets lower the incidence of epileptic seizures. The biochemistry behind that is not well understood at this point in time, but it's an effect that has been well demonstrated. So if you are prone to seizures, then a keto diet allowing some carbs, you have to have some carbs in there, is probably a good idea for overall management of your condition. But those are the only situations in which I would recommend a keto diet. When I hear somebody talking about being on a keto diet and bragging about being in ketosis, what I'm hearing them say is, I'm bragging about putting my body into diabetic shock when I don't have to. Because ultimately, that's the kind of strain you're putting on it. So, bottom line, you can metabolize fats for energy. If you rely on them too much for too long, you're going to have a problem. But for ordinary, everyday consumption, this is not a big issue. Most nutritionists will tell you you should probably get about 18% of your daily calories from fats. And that is probably a good value, 18 to 30% depending on what you're doing. But point is, you need the fat coming in. It's good stuff. You also need the fat for other purposes, namely to make other lipids. Keep in mind that fat in your diet is not just being used for energy. It is also being used to synthesize phospholipids, lipid hormones, and other kinds of lipid molecules your body requires. But our interest here is energetic purposes. So that's our second reserve molecule. Now let's suppose neither fat nor carbs are keeping up with demand. We're not getting enough out of either of those two things. Our third priority metabolic molecule for making ATP is going to be protein. Why is protein at the end of the line? Simple reason is because your body tends to prioritize the proteins you are taking in for other purposes. We want to make our own proteins, right? Our bodies have constant need to make new proteins, whether that's enzymes, whether that's protein hormones, whether that's structural proteins found in your skin and muscles. Your body is continuously in need of proteins. We're making them all the time to carry out a wide range of functions. So when proteins come in from your diet, your body's preference is to say, hey, I'm not going to use that for energy. I'm going to use that for building blocks. Our bodies normally take those proteins that you consume, break them down into their constituent amino acids, and put those amino acids to work in order to build the proteins that you require. This is especially important because there are certain amino acids your body cannot make on its own. Humans can make about 9 of the 20 amino acids in quantities sufficient to meet our metabolic needs as long as we're being fed. We can synthesize about 9 of those amino acids. There are an additional 2 amino acids that your body can make a little bit of, but it can't make quite as much of them as it needs. It needs to supplement with an outside source of those amino acids. There are 9 amino acids your body must get from the environment. There are 9 amino acids that the bodies of animals, or most animals I should say, cannot synthesize at all, and therefore the only way for you to obtain them is by eating them. So our bodies naturally want to prioritize proteins for raw materials, especially because that's the only way to obtain our essential amino acids. This is also incidentally one reason why a purely vegetarian diet can be difficult to manage, for the simple reason that not all of those amino acids are necessarily found in plant foods. There are a couple of plant foods that are so-called complete proteins, that is, they have all of the essential amino acids your body can't make enough of on its own. Most plants aren't. So if you are living a vegetarian or vegan diet, you want to be really careful about which plant proteins you're consuming, get a wide variety of them, find out what plants are good sources for each of the essential amino acids. I always say if you want to be a vegan or vegetarian right, learn some biochemistry, because otherwise you're probably going to end up with a weird amino acid deficiency somewhere down the line. So that said, even though our bodies tend to look at proteins and say, let's use that for building blocks, we can utilize proteins as a source of energy. And if you're a carnivore, if you're a wolf or another animal that similarly is getting most of its energy from meat, then protein is your primary go-to. The process of breaking down proteins for energy is called deamination. D-E-A-M-I-N-A-T-I-O-N. Deamination. Please be careful with that word. Somebody always writes deanimation on the test. Deanimation is when you kill Mickey Mouse. Deamination is when you kill proteins. So, your deamination process, think of deaminate amino, we're deaminoing, if that helps. We break down those proteins, but again, we can't put them directly into glycolysis, just like we can't put fats directly into glycolysis. Instead, when we deaminate proteins, we get two metabolically useful molecules. One, we get pyruvate, and you already know what we can do with that. We can bind it to coenzyme A and send it into the citric acid cycle. What am I saying? Send it to pyruvate oxidation, where it can be used to make acetyl. One step ahead of myself. The other molecule that we get out of this process is oxaloacetate. Remember, we talked about oxaloacetate. It's one of the things you need for the citric acid cycle. So you can use that to go into the citric acid cycle to bind with acetyl and carry the process out to make citric acid. So in other words, we can't start this whole chain with glycolysis with protein. But what we can do is we can make pyruvate and oxaloacetate to keep further steps running, to keep pyruvate oxidation going and to keep the citric acid cycle going. So proteins basically let us make energy in kind of an indirect way that way, just like fats. How good is this? Well, overall, proteins are about as good as carbs. 1 gram of protein will give you approximately the same caloric yield as 1 gram of carbs, about 4 kilocalories of energy per gram. Now you might think to yourself, okay, if carbs and proteins are equivalent energy sources, why do I not get the same amount of calories out of a stalk of celery as I do out of an equivalently sized chunk of meat? It's because meat is much more calorically dense. You've got a lot more protein molecules packed much more closely together. Keep in mind that a lot of your vegetable matter is cellulose, which is not digestible. It's the fiber in your diet, dietary fiber. And therefore, when you eat a fruit or vegetable, a lot of the bulk of that is not being used to make energy. When you eat a piece of meat, the majority of it is being used to make energy. There are some byproducts you can't digest, but most of it is being metabolized. So that is why you're going to find basically more calories in a quantity of meat than in an equivalent quantity of vegetable, even though the caloric yield of protein and carbs is about the same per gram of mass. So you can see we've got a couple of ways of extracting energy from these other molecules. Can you live all on proteins? There's a lot of argument about this, quite frankly. It's very much in dispute with the science about the long-term effects of an omnivorous animal like ourselves eating primarily proteins. It does appear that you can get away with having a primary protein diet a lot more than a primary fat diet, because you're not producing any kind of, dangerous byproduct like ketones. However, we do find that omnivores have digestive tracts that are specialized to need some plant matter in there as well. We need the non-digestible plant fiber to move our feces along. So you're going to find that you're going to be straining more to eliminate feces if you're having a primarily protein diet without enough vegetable matter in it. Constipation is not an unusual problem among Americans because most of us are not getting enough fiber. Straining to eliminate means greater likelihood of colon polyps, means greater likelihood of colon cancer. Furthermore, if you're eating primarily animal protein, well, you know what? You're taking in a lot of fat and cholesterol along with that, right? Which means that you have long-term effects possibly on your heart and your blood vessels and so forth, high blood pressure, risk of heart attack and all of that, hardening of the arteries. There is some evidence that protein exclusive diet puts more strain on your kidneys over time, and that if you're eating much more protein than carbs, that it can make you more prone to kidney failure later in life. But that's actually not well studied at this point in time. It's kind of hard to do long-term studies on it because human dietary variety is going to make it hard to do that under controlled conditions. Bottom line, it's probably a bit safer to eat more proteins than it is to eat more fats, but hopefully what you're getting out of all of this is that a smart diet is going to include proportions of all of those things. Mostly carbs for energy, supplement with some fats, proteins as third priority. All right, sounding good. So those are some of the ways in which we can do this. Let me talk about a fun little thing for a moment here. You might be thinking, okay, so why does the stuff that's bad for me taste so good? Why do I want the sugar and the fat? Why do I crave pizza instead of celery? Maybe you do crave celery. I'm not knocking it if you do. But the average person probably is going to want the pizza more than they're going to want the celery, right? So what is it that makes us crave fat and sugar? If you already learned that having those things in abundance is not going to be good for you, why do we still want them so bad? The answer lies in a thing called optimal foraging theory. Optimal foraging theory is a dietary model you're not going to hear about in your biology textbook, at least not your average bio textbook, because it's derived from the field of primatology. And it's a field that talks about basically what happens when an omnivore, a primate, is in a wild condition looking for food. And what the optimal foraging theory model tells us is that given a choice of options, a primate will select the food that gives it the most calories for the least efforts. So in other words, given your choice, you're going to pick the food that is the most calorically dense, the most bang for your buck, the most calories all in one go. The reason for that is quite simply because in the wild, you don't know where your next meal is coming from. Keep in mind that for 95% of the history of our species, Homo sapiens has been a nomadic hunter-gatherer, prowling the landscape, looking for food wherever we could find it. We were not always in a position to be choosy. But when we were, we evolved to want the foods that gave us the most energy in one go. Because that means you can go longer till your next meal. In other words, it's a survival strategy to avoid starvation. If I like the taste of fatty and sugary stuff, when I acquire it in the wild, I'm going to say, that's the good stuff. I'm going to eat as much of it as I can, and my brain is going to reward me with a rush of dopamine, the pleasure chemicals, saying, man, that tastes good. That's good stuff. Keep eating more of it. Because that's your body's way of building up a reserve for an unknown future in which you can't guarantee that you're going to find more food tomorrow. In other words, this is a really good survival strategy for an organism that is living in the wild, prowling around hunting for food. It gears us to invest more energy in calorically dense foods. We're going to eat more berries than we're going to eat leaves. We're going to eat more nuts than we're going to eat leaves. We're going to eat meat in preference to vegetables in a lot of cases when we can get it, because all these things are making the choice of the most calorically dense food. Model this experimentally. Put a chimpanzee in a room, give him access to equal quantities of several different foods with different densities of calories. The chimp will almost invariably choose the highest calorie food first, because we are evolved to like the taste of high calorie stuff. Because for your ancestors, that meant you stayed alive longer. It meant you didn't starve as easily. Now, fast forward hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. Let's go to the 20th century, where for the first time in human history, sugar and fat is cheap and plentiful. In nature, those are the rare food sources. It's harder to kill a wild animal than it is to gather fruits and nuts and leaves. On your bush, you're going to have more leaves than you're going to have berries, right? In other words, low-calorie stuff is easier to find than high-calorie stuff in the wild. But now we have mass food production. Now we have supermarkets. You are what anthropologists like to call a market forager, meaning that you acquire your food not from prowling around in the wilderness, but from prowling around Giant Eagle. So, here's the thing. 60 million years of primate evolution has not taken away that instinct just because in the past 75 years we've had grocery stores. Monkey brain doesn't know that you have tomorrow's food in the fridge. All that monkey brain knows is that thing with all the fat and sugar in it tastes good. Eat more of it right now. Monkey brain is trying to guard you against starvation, even if you, logically yourself, know that you've got plenty of food in the cabinet. And this, folks, is why we crave the fatty and sugary stuff, because we have a whole lot of primate evolution telling us we should be doing exactly that. And that instinct is not going to go away just because we find ourselves in a society where food scarcity, at least for most people, is not too much of a problem. At least not here. Obviously, for a lot of the world it is. And you can bet for those folks, for people whose food is scarce, this is a very, very helpful instinct to have. All right, though. That's a little bit of a digression from our side topic. It's not even really a topic for this class, but I thought it was kind of a fun thing to bring up. But let's talk for a few minutes about anaerobic respiration. Let's talk about ways of making energy that have nothing to do with glucose, or actually not with glucose, involve glucose, nothing to do with oxygen. There are plenty of ways of doing this without oxygen. I mentioned a couple of them already in the last lesson. Let's talk about fermentation. Fermentation is a reaction that every cell can do if it has to. Even cells like our own that engage primarily in aerobic respiration could do fermentation in a pinch. What kind of a pinch? Well, let's just say, all right, you're sitting here, you're relaxed, you're at your ease, you're listening to my lecture, you're calm, hopefully, sitting in your chair, heart rate's not going too high. All of a sudden, bears attack! I don't know where the bears are coming from, you know. All of a sudden, dragons attack! And I have to fight off the dragon, or I have to throw you in front of the dragon, or whatever else needs to happen in order to keep myself safe. Suddenly, I have to go from low energy production to high energy production real quick, right? My cells were not making lots and lots and lots of ATP at first because I was in a state of rest. But now, I have to have muscular action. I have to fight back. I have to push this beast off of me, right? I need more energy, and I need it right now. I can't wait around. This dragon here is not going to wait for me to ramp up the production of more ATP before he eats me. See? So, my cells are going to have to increase ATP production to meet the demand when suddenly I go from low activity to high activity. That's going to mean increasing my pulse rate. That's going to mean increasing my breathing rate. So I take in more oxygen, deliver it to my cells faster, deliver glucose to my cells faster, so my mitochondria can make more ATP more quickly. But that's not instantaneous. I go from a state of sitting here at rest at my desk to suddenly having to fight the dragon right here, and I do that quickly. It's going to take 40 to 60 seconds before increased respiratory activity and increased heart rate are going to effectively deliver enough more glucose and more oxygen to my cells to keep up with the high demand. But I got to fight this beast right now. So my cells are going to make up the difference through fermentation. They're going to switch to an anaerobic form of respiration using organic molecules as the final electron acceptor. This lets me make ATP really swiftly so I can fight off the dragon. So, for the first 30 to 45 seconds of increased activity, when you go from a state of rest to a state of action, your body is going to supplement aerobic respiration with fermentation to give you more ATP to work with until such time as your bloodstream and your lungs are bringing in enough additional resources to keep up with the demand. Now, okay, sounds good. Why don't we do this all the time? Two reasons. One, fermentation is not terribly efficient. We're not making a lot of ATP this way. We cannot sustain high activity long term. Fermentation at best is going to get you by for about 45 seconds to a minute. By that time, assuming you're in good health and you're able to breathe and everything, your cells are getting enough increased levels of oxygen and glucose to ramp up ATP production so they don't have to keep relying on fermentation. It will still continue at low levels in the background. Even if you're an athlete at peak condition, breathing well, you're still making like 5% of your energy from fermentation in the background the whole time that you're going hard. But the other reason you can't sustain this long term is the chemical waste products. Fermentation is using an organic molecule as the final electron acceptor. In fermentation, you're basically carrying out glycolysis, the first step of aerobic respiration, splitting your glucose into two molecules of pyruvate. You make some ATP. Remember, each molecule of glucose gives us a net of 2 ATP after glycolysis. What's going to happen in fermentation is the pyruvate molecules, these pyruvic acid derivatives from the glucose, are going to become our electron acceptors. They are going to serve as the place where the spent electrons go at the end of the line, because without oxygen, we can't carry out the higher steps of aerobic respiration. There are two different ways of doing fermentation. We have so-called lactic acid fermentation, and we have ethanol fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation is what your muscles do whenever you're trying to keep up with demand in the short term after you go from rest to activity. We call it that because the chemical waste product we get out of this when we add electrons and hydrogen ions to pyruvic acid is a thing called lactic acid. You all know about lactic acid, right? Builds up in your muscles when you're exercising, induces a state of fatigue. After a while, the more lactic acid gets in there, the lower the pH in your muscle tissue gets, begins to interfere with the chemical reactions that make the muscles go. You begin to experience muscular fatigue. Build up too much of this, the lactic acid levels can actually damage the muscle tissue. You know how you have a workout some days and you get that good ache the next day? That's what you want. When you get a burning in your muscles the next day, that's bad. That was too much lactic acid buildup. You pushed it too hard. You want to modulate a little bit more next time. Contrary to what they tell you, there is such thing as too much pain that does not give you gain, and contrary to popular belief, lactic acid buildup does not make your muscles heal back stronger after they repair the damage. Given enough time, our bodies will clear lactic acid, our cells will send lactates to the liver, and the liver will put them through a nifty process called gluconeogenesis. Gluconeogenesis, gluconeogenesis, in which lactic acid is slowly converted back into glucose. But it takes some time to do. So the toxic waste buildup here is a big reason why you can't do this indefinitely. Now, the other form of fermentation is called ethanol fermentation. The product here is alcohol. You're going to make alcohols, most specifically ethanol, as your chemical waste products. This is the fermentation process engaged in by yeasts and by a lot of bacteria. And this is a process that we as humans, a long time ago, learned to use to make tasty alcoholic beverages. Think this is water in here? Actually, yeah, it's water. So yeah, we've learned to utilize the waste products of fermentation from other organisms to make alcohol. But for them, that's a byproduct. So fermentation is a thing every living cell can do if it has to. If you're a yeast, you do it all the time. If you're certain microorganisms, you do it all the time. But for our bodies, it's a stopgap. It's a thing we do short-term anaerobically until oxygen intake keeps up with demand. But let's talk about true anaerobic respiration. Fermentation is technically a form of anaerobic respiration because it doesn't involve oxygen. But when we use the term anaerobic respiration in biochemistry, we are almost always referring to a process whereby we are making ATP without oxygen being involved and with an inorganic molecule as the final electron acceptor. That's the key feature of anaerobic respiration, that the final electron acceptor is an inorganic molecule. Now, anaerobic respiration is not one metabolic pathway. It is an umbrella term for several different ways of making ATP, mostly carried out by a wide range of bacteria and archaeans, prokaryotic organisms, in other words. All forms of anaerobic respiration are a lot simpler than aerobic respiration. They do not require mitochondria. All forms of anaerobic respiration produce very low amounts of ATP. On average, most types of anaerobic respiration give you 2 molecules of ATP for every molecule of glucose that goes in. In a lot of ways, it's very similar to fermentation. You're basically carrying out glycolysis and not able to carry it much further from there. Or a reaction kind of like glycolysis anyway. Now, what do you use as the final electron acceptor? there are a bunch of different options. Sulfate molecules like SO2, nitrate molecules like NO2, carbon dioxide. All of these things can become electron acceptors for different kinds of fermentation. So it's not just one form of anaerobic respiration. Different bacterial lineages and different archaean lineages have several ways of making a living this way. Let me give you a couple of examples. A very well-known group of archaeans, of microorganisms belonging to the domain Archaea, that engage in anaerobic respiration are the methanogens. M-E-T-H-A-N-G... Wait, got lost in my own word. M-E-T-H-A-N-O-G-E-N-S. Methanogens. Methanogens live primarily in stagnant water environments, anoxic environments with very, very little water. It's like swamp water, for example. You also find them living in your intestinal tract. You have methanogens that live inside of your colon and your large intestine. Methanogens engage in a form of anaerobic respiration in which they use carbon dioxide as the final electron acceptor. Their chemical waste products from this are water and CH4, a gas better known as methane. Hence we call them methanogens, methane generators. Bubbles of methane will build up underwater in swampy environments. If you've ever been squelching around in the swamp for any reason, maybe you have different hobbies than I do, then bubbles of swamp gas might come up periodically, and that swamp gas is the stored methane. You also produce methane in your digestive tract. You produce methane in your colon. And periodically, your body releases that methane gas to the amusement of 12-year-olds everywhere. So methanogens are a part of our day-to-day lives. Incidentally, it's been suggested this might be a good form of clean energy production. Methane, when it burns, yields water as its chemical waste product. So it's the thought, hey, maybe we can make clean energy, bioenergy, by using methanogens to ferment stuff, well, not ferment, but to break down stuff, and collecting the methane that they give off. And in fact, there are a couple of power plants that do this using cow manure. We've built several plants now that make electricity using methanogens and cow manure to produce methane gas and collect it and burn it to power a generator. Now you might think, hey, this is a great way to get rid of my cow manure and a great way of making electricity. Why are we not doing this more? Large part because who wants to live near the poop-fired power plant? It's a tough political sell, quite frankly, and not a lot of folks want to have that one in their district, and so therefore a lot of politicians haven't been happy to endorse it. Hopefully we'll get around to using it a bit more. My favorite anaerobic organisms, and one of the most remarkable living things on Earth, would be a group of organisms called the sulfur bacteria. Despite their name, sulfur bacteria aren't bacteria. They are members of the domain Archaea, A-R-C-H-A-E-A, if you don't remember that term. Archaeans were the oldest living things on the planet. The word Archaean means ancient ones. Prefix archae, like archaeology, ancients. Archaeans were the first living things, single-celled organisms that appeared on Earth about 3.9 billion years ago. Today, they mostly live in very isolated, harsh environments, primarily low-oxygen environments where other organisms cannot live. And the sulfur bacteria are really cool this way. If you go down to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, about halfway between Europe and North America, you'll find a crack in the seafloor called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. This is a place where the continental plates that North America and Europe are on are slowly spreading apart from each other at a rate of about a centimeter per year. But as they spread, magma comes up from the Earth's interior, touches the sea floor, touches the water, boils the water instantly, but then the magma cools off to form lava rock. So we are constantly forming new rock at these places all the time, new lava rock forming from magma as it contacts the seawater. As a result, this environment is constantly volcanically active, full of sulfur, not a lot of oxygen, temperatures in excess of boiling at all times. Harsh, nasty environment. This is an environment that existed on the early Earth. Most of the planet was like this 3.9 billion years ago. And this is the environment where life first began. You look in those volcanic vents today, you will find sulfur bacteria, single-celled archaean organisms that are adapted to these very, very harsh conditions. Archaeans aren't happy in the conditions you and I live in. They explode at temperatures below boiling. They die instantly in the presence of too much oxygen. But down there in that volcanic vent, with all that energy and that heat, they thrive. They use energy harvested from the continuous volcanic reactions there as a power source for their metabolism. Sulfur dioxide, SO2, is going to be their primary electron acceptor. When they metabolize this, they're going to make water and a molecule called hydrogen sulfide, H2S, as their waste products. Now, sulfur bacteria are pretty cool that way because they've managed to survive in an environment that's nothing like what we can even begin to imagine. But the coolest thing about them is that they give us a pretty good picture of what the first life on Earth was like. Because all of Earth was like those volcanic vents 3.9 billion years ago. Those were the environments in which the first living things emerged. And their metabolism necessarily would have had to be something like that of the sulfur bacteria for them to get by in that environment. So it is quite probable that sulfur bacteria are the oldest living things on the planet, and their form of anaerobic respiration shows us how the first cells made their living. Now, here's where this gets really fun. Hydrogen sulfide is their waste product, which means that as the early sulfur bacteria are producing hydrogen sulfide, more and more of it is building up in the water of our planet's oceans. You may not know this because we haven't talked about it in class yet, but you know what you need hydrogen sulfide for? A thing called photosynthesis, which means that as sulfur bacteria added more and more hydrogen sulfide to the waters of the early oceans, they were making the chemical environment needed for the evolution of photosynthesis. And by about 3 billion years ago, photosynthesis appears in microorganisms, organisms called cyanobacteria, or blue-green algae. Now, photosynthesis, you might recall, what does it produce as a byproduct? Oxygen. Pure oxygen. For the first time in our planet's history, our atmosphere begins to have free oxygen in it about 3 billion years ago. As the atmosphere becomes oxygenated, there are less and less places where the sulfur bacteria can live. They're poisoned by pure oxygen. So they retreat to those volcanic vents on the bottom of the ocean, the only environments that can still sustain them. And photosynthesis becomes a more and more common way of making a living. But photosynthesis is adding oxygen to the atmosphere. And oxygen in the atmosphere makes possible the evolution of aerobic microbes, the ancestors of the modern mitochondria. In other words, we have a chain here where these living things are literally changing the chemistry of the planet. The sulfur bacteria produced hydrogen sulfide, making possible the evolution of photosynthesis through a chemical process that employs it. The photosynthesizers destroyed a lot of the conditions in which the sulfur bacteria thrived, forced them to retreat to the bottom of the sea, but they, in turn, released oxygen, creating circumstances in which aerobic organisms can appear. So we see that we have this cycle whereby one kind of living thing changes the chemistry of Earth in a way that another living thing can adapt to and build a new way of getting by. So the sulfur bacteria are kind of instrumental to the planet that we live on. And although they're a bit player in the ecosystem today, at one time they set up the conditions that allowed all more complex life to appear. Pretty cool, huh? All right, folks, so that is all I've got for you in our chapter on respiration. Hopefully you've enjoyed these last 2 lessons. Starting from here, we're going to move on to talking about a thing called cell division. So look for my next lesson on that. Thank you for your attention. Hope you have a good rest of the day. Watch out for those dragons. And I would like to thank my colleague, Elliot, for his guest appearance today. He doesn't get out very much, so he likes an opportunity to say hi to people. Good night, folks.